If I say David Lynch, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? It's probably Twin Peaks, but my point is, your first experience with his work probably ended with you thinking it was weird. A lot of people have the view on David Lynch that his films are weird and they make no sense, but I promise that they do. They really do make sense. In this video essay, I'm going to briefly explain some of his most prolific films, but there's a reason. There's a common theme throughout a lot of his work that I want to explore, so join me as I take a leap of faith down the weird rabbit hole of Lynchian insanity and try to unravel the many threads of his mind. David Keith Lynch, one of my all-time favourite directors, known for his bizarre and surreal worlds that feel like a progressively deteriorating dream. A style that's so well known and beloved that it led to the term Lynchian being coined. How many directors have a word coined to describe their unique style? David Lynch made so many incredible pieces of cinema during his near 60-year career, but today I'm not going to cover all of them. In particular, I'm going to look at Eraserhead from 1977, Twin Peaks from 1989 to 2017, Blue Velvet from 1986, Mulholland Drive from 2001, Lost Highway from 1997, and Wild at Heart from 1990. And before I really get started, just like every video I have done and every video I will do, I need to clarify something. This is all my interpretation, my perspective. I'm not saying that this is all confirmed to be the exact meaning behind these films, but this is what I got from them. Everyone's perspective varies because everyone's experiences vary, so bearing that in mind, I'm going to start by briefly explaining the common themes, then cover how each film connects to them. David Lynch highlights the fear in the mundane and the desire to escape. He takes people's natural ability to daydream and presents it as an idealized world that we don't realize is fantasy until it's too late, letting the characters and the audience fall further down their own rabbit holes of escapism while the real world crumbles before them, possibly hinting towards a message of facing your real life instead of ignoring it, but also suggesting that the horrors we truly fear is the normal life. We live in an imagined world because of our strong aversion to living in reality. The interesting thing is, David Lynch does this by showing our characters doing seemingly normal things. And that depiction varies, whether it shows normal everyday tasks as being impossible and seemingly nightmarish, or whether it shows those normal tasks as a desire, making the mundane seem almost dreamlike. Interestingly, despite those two depictions seemingly conflicting with each other, they both contribute to a similar meaning: a lack of acceptance in reality due to a desire for a different life. The main thing that differs between the examples in the films is the cause of that desire and the life that those characters view as desirable. But throughout his work, Lynch consistently depicts a world that looks normal and sometimes approachable on the surface, only to turn it inside out and reveal the rot that sits beneath. However, that is not the only theme present throughout David Lynch's work. There is an equally present and arguably more interesting theme. He depicts the problems caused by male-dominated institutions in society by using a consistent theme of male ignorance and insecurities. In the case of David Lynch's work, those male-dominated institutions tend to be criminal ones: sexual assault, murder, and violence in all form. Actions and behaviours that are directly caused by the arrogant ignorance of men, which is then justified by men through the use of their insecurities, and these horrible actions tend to be at the centre of the stories within David Lynch's films. Yes, there is an ever-present theme of desire and a desire to escape, and using the fantasies and dreams of the characters to represent that escapism. But the darker side of those stories, the real life, the threats that these characters are trying to escape from, is more often than not directly the fault of men. David Lynch pulls from the dangers of the way that society sees masculinity, specifically that toxic masculinity that we're all aware of, and the dangerous male behaviours that seem to be encouraged by society due to their intertwined nature with traditional masculine behaviours. Things that have become the norm in the way in which men act. Things that have been accepted by most people as a permanent fixture, but despite that, they are things that are morally deplorable. And to expand on all of that and make my view clearer, it's time to cover the first film on the agenda, and I'm going to start with one of the first David Lynch films I saw. Wild at Heart tells the story of Sailor Ripley and Lula Pace Fortune as they venture on a road trip to escape the world they were stuck in search of a new life together. The world that they are surrounded by is scary. It's filled with crime and danger and people that want them dead. They have both individually experienced traumatic lives, and this story is showing them fleeing that as they essentially escape their past in search for something more. The journey has been compared to The Wizard of Oz and draws a lot of inspiration from The Wizard of Oz. A character, in the case of Wild Heart it's two characters, but a character placed in an undesirable life dreams of more and follows a long, winding path into the unknown in hopes of escaping their current fate. Sailor and Lula start out their journey in the worst place. In danger. People threatening their lives. Living in a world where it feels like their love is forbidden. Bound by a bond through their trauma and trust in each other, they venture out, fleeing that horrifying world, and as they do, things momentarily seem to improve. Their freedom starts shining through the darkness, and we see moments of positivity. But it's all still surrounded by that seedy underbelly of society that they cannot truly escape. The closer and closer they get to freedom, the more seemingly evil the world gets around them. Sexual assault, death, violence, and manipulation chases them, almost as if the world they live in is a living character in itself. The world realizes that they might escape and find that freedom that they desire, so it grabs on and holds tightly, throwing every horrible and evil thing it can in their direction to slow them down. But as they get closer and closer to freedom, glimpses of good can be seen. Expanding on that connection to The Wizard of Oz, we see Glinda the Good Witch appear as a physical manifestation of their potential happiness and freedom. However, as is similar to a lot of David Lynch's films, this could be interpreted in a couple different ways. Sure, you could see it as Glinda representing a physical manifestation of the happiness that they desired from their journey, showing that they can achieve that or even are achieving it. But you could also interpret that as the veil of reality slipping. Perhaps the evil world that they were so desperate to flee did catch up to them. Take the actual story of The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy leaves the real world and finds herself in the land of Oz. Now, lost in an unfamiliar place, she journeys through this new world in search of answers and a way home. As she gets closer and closer to leaving this unbelievable world, getting closer to finding her way home, the people she's meeting, the places she's going, and the things that are happening become almost more unbelievable, more and more fantastical. Almost as if the dreamlike world that she's in is slowly losing its solidity. The believability of this dream is melting before her as she's about to leave it. Similar to real dreams becoming less and less easy to grasp and understand as you slowly wake up. Something that seems so real and vivid slowly becomes unintelligible. Imagining Dorothy's journey into Oz as a dream world that slowly started to crumble as she found her way out of it, but instead of crumbling in the way that you would imagine through horrific and dark events, it becomes more desirable, more comforting, as if while the dream is disappearing, it's trying to lure you in further. Now, bearing that interpretation of The Wizard of Oz in mind, compare it to Wild at Heart. Sailor and Lula play the role of our Dorothy in this story. The horrible, traumatic life they were living plays the role of Kansas. No offense to anyone who lives in Kansas. And their journey, the road trip that they take, represents Dorothy's journey in Oz. As they get closer and closer to the end, the lines between reality and fantasy blur, which is shown through Glinda's appearance. As the fantasy takes over, dreamlike things bridge into reality. Now, as I said, that can be interpreted in a positive light, suggesting that they did reach that free, euphoric life that they desired, and we are being shown that through the positivity and colourful nature of The Wizard of Oz. Or it could be interpreted in a more negative light, suggesting that maybe they didn't reach that life. Maybe they found themselves stuck in that horrible past that they tried to escape. Maybe they died, and this is the fantasy that they imagined flashing before their eyes in their fleeting moments before they enter the eternal darkness. Either way, Lynch took two characters with traumatic lives who have experienced events that a lot of people are familiar with: sexual assault, prison, violence, threats, and death, and showed them trying to escape that, and implied their use of fantasy and hope as a method of escape. I mentioned that David Lynch also involves themes of common institutions that are upheld by men, and that is present here too. On the surface level, there is obviously the violent and erratic behaviour, but Lula's life has been controlled by the actions of men since she was a young girl. It's mentioned that she was sexually assaulted as a young girl, which still affects her now, and that vulnerability is preyed on by Bobby Peru. A man who stands as a representation of male violence preys on that vulnerability of Lula's character and assaults her, showing that as long as those institutions are in place and as long as that behaviour is still seen as the norm, people will never truly escape it. I've seen this film described as one of Lynch's more simplistic films, and I disagree with that sentiment. I don't think this is a simplistic film at all. I think it could be interpreted as a relatively simplistic love story on the road, but I think there's much more underneath the surface. I particularly loved Lynch's description of the film being finding love in hell. The consistent use of fire throughout the film is fascinating to me, because I think this is one of the more obvious parts of the symbolism throughout the film. The fire suggests that as they venture further and further into their dream life, they get further and further away from those traumatic events of their past, each traumatic moment being represented by fire, which could be seen as either the fire destroying those traumatic memories, possibly implying that the fire represents something along the lines of sterilization, the cleansing of their past, or even possibly representing the traumatic events themselves, the fire being each traumatic event showing that it's not permanent and it will burn out. Then again, the fire could also represent the destruction caused by their trauma. I also think that Wild at Heart could be interpreted as an ego-fueled, male-driven fantasy. Sailor Ripley is seen attacking a man. He gets arrested and goes to prison. Now, this is one possible interpretation, but I think that it could be interpreted that everything from Sailor being released from prison all the way to the end is his fantasy and not what's actually happening. His obsession with being perceived in a cool light being almost an incessant need to impress Lula. Looking at their story with this interpretation, let's analyse how the real story could have played out. Sailor and Lula were out together at an event. Sailor is attacked and he retaliates by killing the attacker. Lula is understandably shaken. Sailor is arrested and taken to prison. At this point, I think that Sailor could be dreaming about being free, a life outside of prison, so he sees his story as Lula returning, bringing his treasured jacket and a car, ready to take back his identity and ride off into freedom with the woman he loves. We then see them have sex, possibly a part of Sailor's base desires. After this, Lula reflects on her traumatic childhood, revealing to the audience that she was raped. This could imply the reason that Sailor and Lula are drawn to each other. Sailor having that standard male desire of a woman who needs to depend on him, and Lula finding some security in Sailor's primal need to protect her. This plays on that male fantasy of being seen as the hero to a woman that they desire, which is further developed when they see Power Mad. We see a man interrupt Sailor and Lula's time together, and this man starts trying to dance with Lula. Sailor challenges him and ends up knocking him to the ground. Sailor then proceeds to take the microphone and sing an Elvis song to Lula. As he does, we hear the women in the audience cheering and screaming for Sailor. I think this further plays into that male fantasy, which is only exaggerated by using Elvis specifically, a somewhat idolized figure in the eyes of white men due to the infatuation of him by his female audience, something that a lot of those men desired but never got. Sailor's strong desire to be seen in a heroic light is almost cut short as he gets entangled into a bank robbery with Bobby Peru. I think Sailor's fear in that situation could have represented his true fear shining through into the dream, but as he escaped with Lula, he drifted further into his fantasy. As the reality of his life became clearer, which is shown through the situations he's in getting worse and more dangerous, his dream tried to lure him back into its blissful arms, which is seen through the use of Glinda the Good Witch. As I said, Wild at Heart gets described as more simplistic, and as I hope I made clear, I don't think that it is. Granted, it's not the most bizarre and fascinating connection to those common themes that I talked about, but it is still a fascinatingly bizarre story with so much potential for different interpretations. That common theme of a fear of the mundane and a desire to escape is present throughout the journey. A lot of the things they encounter are seemingly normal. Even the more horrific events are still things that happen every day. But on the surface, this is a loving couple on a road trip. A normal thing that's surrounded by and hunted down by the most horrific things people can experience. So the characters escape into a fantasy to ignore those horrific experiences. Possibly even connecting a link to the idea of people using fantasy to escape their memories of trauma. Either way, Lynch takes a relatively normal thing, a road trip and a romance, and turns it on its head, making it something that you want to escape from, making it something that causes discomfort and fear, leading to the only real escape being to daydream your way out of it. That's Wild at Heart, and I hope you're comfortable because that's only one film and 5 more to go. Lost Highway. What can I say other than holy shit? This film blew me away. So, Lost Highway tells the story of jazz musician Fred Madison, who has a strained relationship with his wife Renee. After walking in on her cheating on him, he kills her. This results in him being sent to death row. Then, we cut to another man, a mechanic, who finds himself wrapped up in a criminal plot as he tries to unravel the mysteries surrounding a woman that he's become infatuated with. But in classic Lynchian fashion, this man is not real. This story is not real. As Fred is taken to his cell on death row, we see a sort of portal to another world open up in front of him. This is him moving from the real world to the fantasy in his head. Whilst on death row, he is imagining an idealistic life for himself. The situation he has gotten himself into has driven him to insanity, and now his only choice is to escape into a dream world. A world where he's younger, manlier, attractive to women, has a much more interesting life with all of the qualities that he wishes he had. In an interesting commentary on toxic masculinity, David Lynch manages to depict Fred's idealistic world as what insecure men wish they were. Insecure, toxic men have this view of women that means they think women in general are shallow, only out for the buff, rich, masculine, powerful men, and they criticize women for that, judge them for it, and blame all of their own problems on women for their choices and who they date. Despite the fact that deep down, those insecure men are just jealous of men who have things that they do not. And despite blaming women for those problems, it's the patriarchy that's actually at fault. A system set up by men is causing distress to these men But those men are so indoctrinated and brainwashed by that system that they blame women for the faults caused by men. As has been seen in a lot of cases where a woman cheats on a man, the man who is a victim, or men who talk about the situation, instantly jump to the idea that it must have been because the man wasn't manly enough, or rich, or powerful enough, and that's exactly how Fred feels. His wife cheated on him, and instead of seeing that as a horrible thing that she did, he jumped straight to blaming his personality and the judgmental and shallow choices of women, and that led him to imagine himself as what he thinks is a man in the female gaze. So he fantasizes about being younger, stronger, braver, rather than becoming any of those qualities himself or changing who he is or growing as a person. He sits in his own problems and dreams of a different life. Another example of a character in David Lynch's work that, instead of facing the problems surrounding them, decides to shut them out, ignore them, and dream of what it would be like if life was better. But because of Fred's toxic masculinity and the traits of the patriarchy that he possesses, even his idealistic world is filled with those horrible things that he can't truly escape. Even in his dream world, he still sees women through that unrealistic, tainted view. Within his fantasy, he becomes infatuated with a woman called Alice Wakefield. And instead of fantasizing about having a nice life with the woman he loved, this character he creates in his subconscious is sexualized, assaulted. She's a victim. His idealistic world is one in which he is younger, stronger, braver, and more powerful, and his wife is reduced to a sexualized victim that has to rely on him for safety. Throughout the film, it's not entirely clear that this is a fantasy until nearing the end of his story. That's when the veil of reality starts to slip. Fred becomes himself again. He's no longer that younger, more attractive man that he saw himself as. He's now back to his regular self. The world around him starts to change. Familiar faces return. As he nears his death on death row, he begins to flee within his dream, being chased into the darkness, and as his end catches up with him in the dream, his end catches up with him in real life. As he starts to escape from the people within his fantasy, we see flashes of light surrounding him, and then the film ends. The flashes of light being the electricity as he's strapped into the electric chair. An insecure man falls into a dark hole of his own insecurities to escape the reality of his inevitable death. This film perfectly plays on both themes, showing the fantasy as reality and presenting it as so believable that it implies Fred can no longer distinguish between his dream and reality, but also shows the shared insecurities and aggressions of men are through the result of their ignorance and lack of understanding of the people around them. This is shown through Fred's treatment and view of women within his fantasy, and expanded on by what he considers the dream version of himself. I mentioned that he still sees women through that unrealistic, tainted view, and to me, that's the darkest and most relevant part of Lost Highway. Fred, faced with the thought of his wife being unfaithful, kills her. Driven insane by his limited life on death row, he fantasizes and dreams of a preferable life, but this is a man who's feeling emasculated. Through his insecurities in his own masculinity, he fantasizes about his wife being a victim to uplift his own masculinity. In his ideal situation, his wife is reduced to a sexual victim who can only be truly protected by him, perpetuating that typically toxic masculine view of women being weak and needing a man to save them. It's mentioned that Fred likes to remember things his own way, not the way that they actually happened, implying that he is not only an unreliable narrator, but he's aware of that. He admits he remembers things in his own way, so perhaps we have been seeing the story from his perspective since the start. Perhaps his wife wasn't cheating on him. Perhaps it was his male-centered, egotistical ignorance that led to a paranoid mistrust in his wife, and to deflect his guilt onto another person, he chose to misremember the truth about his wife, imagining a reality in which she hurt him first. perhaps the mystery man, Pete, Fred, and Mr. Eddie all play different parts of the same person. Fred is the physical man. The other characters are his fantasy, parts of his dream. The mystery man is his aggressive desires, his violent tendencies embodied in a man, whereas Pete is the egocentric, masculinized version of Fred, the version of himself that he wishes he was, an idealized view of Fred that he desires due to his toxic worldview of what makes a man. And then Mr. Eddie, while violent and aggressive as a character, represents Fred's reason, his realistic views, hence the strong affirmation of the rules. After the mystery man causes him to kill Mr. Eddie, Fred is finally freed from that reason. He's then left with his egocentric view of himself mixed with his base impulsive desire for aggression, leading to him to act on those aggressive desires, resulting in him killing his wife. The interpretation of this being fantasy is further supported by the way we, the audience, move throughout the story. Lynch used blurred fades between shots, sometimes skipping large chunks of time, replicating the way that we perceive dreams, that feeling of what seems like hours or even days passing by in seconds, and the blur adds to that vague and unclear view of the dream itself. The best example of that is also immediately followed by another key example of Pete being an embodiment of Fred. As Alice confesses and recalls the events of her life, events that the audience would consider to be traumatic things that were inflicted upon her by men in power. But just like the insecure man that Fred truly is, Pete radiates some of that toxic masculinity in the way that he quickly jumps to a judgmental stand towards Alice, and in an almost accusatory tone, he questions her motive behind her past, despite her clear implication that there was no true consent given. This connects back to Fred's story and the way that he potentially created a fictional memory of Renee being unfaithful to cover his guilt after acting on an ignorant and judgmental view of his wife. The fact that the truth of Fred's story is buried within a fantasy is interesting, when combined with the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, he admitted that he likes to remember things his own way and not necessarily how they happened. When he says that, he's standing in front of his wife. He's taking a position of power and control over the situation, while Renee stands quietly in the back, almost cowering. His distaste for cameras could be interpreted as a distaste for evidence, a distaste for witnesses. Perhaps Fred was abusing Renee, his position in this scene showing his control over her situation, something that can only be fully understood after we explore the inner workings of his mind. And speaking of the inner workings of his mind, I also find it interesting that in this shot, we see Pete's head open up, revealing camera footage inside. It looks to be the footage of Renee, some evidence of Fred's crime. Interestingly, the footage we see only seems to show Renee, and no third party, possibly standing as some evidence that Fred killed Renee unprovoked. This potentially supports the idea that Fred's anger towards Renee was misplaced, and his view that she was unfaithful was a part of him remembering things in his own way, which is why we are given this reveal after Pete's head physically and literally opens, showing the true inner thoughts of Fred. Despite wanting to remember things in his way, he can't forget what he actually did. No matter which of these interpretations you take away from it, Fred is a fundamentally toxic man who blames his wife for his emasculated insecurities, which takes him down a pipeline leading directly to his death. Lost Highway is, in my opinion, Lynch's coolest connection to that theme of masculinity. And now, to move on to a film that I think everyone has heard of. Blue Velvet, one of Lynch's most popular films, and the first in this video that gives me the chance to gush over Kyle MacLachlan. What a man. So, Blue Velvet tells the story of Jeffrey Beaumont, who returns home to see his father after his father suffers from a near-fatal stroke. After stumbling across a severed ear in a field, he becomes obsessed with investigating this crime himself. He drags high schooler Sandy Williams along with him, and finds himself infatuated with Dorothy Valens, a nightclub singer. After already putting Sandy at risk, he involves himself with Dorothy's personal life and ends up forming a sexual relationship with her that begins from a bizarre power imbalance. He gets caught up with the criminal gang that have kidnapped Dorothy's child, leading to a small standoff with Frank Booth, the head of the criminal gang. Jeffrey manages to shoot Frank, killing him. We then see everyone living happily ever after at the end, in this vibrant Americana fantasy. On the surface, this seems like a simple crime and thriller story, but scratching the surface reveals the Lynchian weirdness beneath. Jeffrey is framed as our main character, and he is presented as obsessive yet courageous. Determined to find out the truth, he endangers the life of a high schooler, develops a dangerous and almost manipulative relationship with Dorothy, yet it's framed as an almost forbidden love. With Jeffrey framed as the central character, the world is viewed from his perspective, which is a naive and ignorant one. He views his relationship with Dorothy as passionate, but from the outside, he broke into her house and engaged her physically when she was at her lowest point, taking advantage of her situation for his own gain. Irrelevant of his intention, he did take advantage of her. Maintaining his perspective throughout the story gives us a biased look at the situation surrounding him, leading to the end, in which the final confrontation results in Frank Booth being shot and killed. As I mentioned, we are then shown an idyllic ending, everyone happy, everything back to normal. But keeping in mind that Jeffrey's perspective is naive and somewhat unreliable. So can this ending be trusted? In my opinion, no, it can't. The way I see it, this ending is a false one. What we see at the end is a fantasy that we wish happened. The film depicts it as Jeffrey surviving the confrontation and going on to live a happy life with everyone safe and with him, including his father. Now, the way his father and Dorothy are shown here is, in my opinion, the biggest hint towards this being a lie. Dorothy is still seen with a worried and distressed look upon her face, as she was before this ending, and Jeffrey's father almost died, yet is miraculously fine by the end of the film. I think that the film intentionally depicts the ending to be misleading. In truth, I believe that Jeffrey died in the final conflict with Frank. I think that the ending we see is not what's actually happening, but this is a slowly fading dream that Jeffrey sees in his final moments. I think that as his life leaves him, he dreams of a happy life where his heroic involvement saved Dorothy and her child, and his dad survived, and his ignorant and heavy-handed approach to the situation actually worked out. Even in his final moments, his self-absorbed ignorance blinded his view of the people around him. Dorothy's worried face, despite the happy ending, implies that this is not real. Perhaps Dorothy is showing a fleeting connection to the real world. Here in Jeffrey's fantasy, she's reunited with her child and everyone is happy. But her face reveals the truth, that in the real world, that happy ending never happened. In the real world, Jeffrey lost, and by extension, so did Dorothy. His dad's presence there only adds to that. The man who recently suffered a stroke that nearly killed him is by some miracle completely fine and together with his son in this fantasy world. Even ignoring Jeffrey's point of view and the main story, there are still some cool connections to the themes in this film. Dennis Hopper's character Frank Booth is presented as a powerful criminal leader with respect from his peers. Yet, he insists on being babied and talked down to by a woman, possibly hinting at the insecurities of powerful and arrogant men, and also possibly hinting at the way that men who are raised to think they are perfect and untouchable, that are then given power or authority, never truly mature. I also think the use of the typical 50s Americana fantasy works as a great contribution to the meaning behind the film. Before Jeffrey's heavy-handed involvement in Dorothy's life, his father is seen living in that Americana-style life. Bright, vibrant, positive, and as we watch Jeffrey delve deeper into the criminal underbelly, the lighting gets darker, the colours drain, the world becomes darker, both visually and thematically. But after Jeffrey seemingly escapes this world, whether that's by surviving the altercation with Frank or by dying, he's back in that colourful world. Once he's free from the dark world he stumbled into, the world regains its life. If we take the ending at face value, take it as Jeffrey surviving, this could imply the way that people often ignore problems once they are no longer directly faced with them. Out of sight, out of mind. But the use of 50s Americana aesthetic is particularly interesting, because it stands to visually represent a time where that aesthetic was used to cover up the very dark underbelly of society. Sure, the style was colourful, the true American dream, the nuclear family, freedom. But in truth, the world people lived in was a lie, which was easy to ignore for middle-class white Americans. But while they lived in that 50s fantasy, racism was everywhere. America was fresh out of World War II, currently at war with North Korea, and not far away from the Vietnam War. The world was less than perfect, way less than the dreamlike fantasy aesthetic that people like to reminisce on. This perfectly parallels its use in Blue Velvet. While the characters and audience are ignorant to the criminal activity in their town, the world is bright and colourful, and that colour returns once they are in a privileged position of blissful ignorance again. This is expanded upon by David Lynch's consistent use of bugs and insects throughout the film. While we are in that vibrant world at the beginning of the film, we see Frank's father collapse due to his stroke. That stroke is the first hint of the true darkness within this world, and as he's on the ground, we see the first presence of the bugs and insects. The next key moment where they are seen is when Jeffrey finds the severed ear, which is the catalyst of Jeffrey's descent into the dark. The most interesting link to insects is Jeffrey's disguise as an exterminator. To explore further into the underbelly of the world, he dresses as a person who kills bugs. If Frank and his criminal gang are the bugs of the world, then Jeffrey killing Frank and exposing his crimes would make him their exterminator. David Lynch is quoted as saying that Blue Velvet is a film about things that are hidden within a small city and within people. As Jeffrey uncovers more clues about Dorothy and Frank, he reveals more of his own personality, becoming more reckless and showing his own intrigue into the way Frank acts with Dorothy. As Jeffrey gives in to his fantasy of being some hero to Dorothy and Sandy, making himself the centre of his world as he becomes self-absorbed, he starts to blend into that darker world that he finds himself trapped in, possibly implying that him succumbing to that predictable male behaviour and worldview makes him a part of the problematic and dangerous parts of our world. Now, we're at the halfway point. 3 down, 3 to go. So let's go ahead and look at the big one. Twin Peaks was a cultural phenomenon, and the way in which I think it connects to the themes is an interesting one. While Twin Peaks does feature many dreams and bizarre fantasies that are presented as reality, that's not the part I want to focus on. The most important part of Twin Peaks to me is the town itself. Twin Peaks is a postcard town. It's idyllic, wonderful nature, a pretty little town. The dream worlds we've discussed so far all share a similarity. They appear one way, but scratch the surface and something darker is revealed underneath. The town of Twin Peaks is the same. An idyllic town that only manages to maintain its appeal by giving in to the dark and seedy underbelly of its residents. From the outside, Twin Peaks seems to be a peaceful town, but all of the residents know more than they are letting on. They ignore the evil that dominates the town in favour of this manufactured fantasy that sustains the image of Twin Peaks. The positive depiction of Twin Peaks is a facade that allows the townspeople to ignore their real problems. The people in Twin Peaks are using the town in the same way that the characters in Lynch's other works are using their dreams and fantasies. Combine this with the story of Laura Palmer, her life and messages from her throughout the show. They hint towards the danger of ignoring and neglecting your problems, the danger of pretending that they don't exist, and the vital need for acceptance and growth in spite of your trauma. There are also multiple hints towards the idea of reality and a dream world. For example, the use of a physical location, the Black Lodge, and the poem, "Through the darkness of future past, the magician longs to see. One chance out between two worlds, fire, walk with me." Another one of Lynch's works to prominently mention fire, possibly as a hint towards rebirth, but also to the damage caused by the events of Laura's story. The mention of two worlds, combined with the idea of the real Twin Peaks and the facade that the residents insist on sustaining, is very similar to the idea of people in David Lynch's other works living in a fantasy world instead of facing the reality and the darkness that actually surrounds them. It's the same theme, but in Twin Peaks it's shown in a much more literal sense of two worlds. There are several other hints and themes that contribute to this. For example, the owls are not what they seem, something that has been mentioned several times throughout Twin Peaks, and just generally hints towards the perceived truth being false. Interestingly, the villain, if that's even the right word, of Twin Peaks is Bob, and he somewhat represents the evil of man. I'm speaking specifically of men. The crimes he commits, specifically the more violent crimes he commits, are crimes that are mainly perpetrated by men and are long-standing, horrible parts of our society that are upheld by men. The clearest example being sexual assault. As I've hopefully made clear, David Lynch really likes to make commentary on men and toxic masculinity and male behaviour. I've already mentioned in Wild at Heart the depiction of sexual assault and the violence of men leading to the danger in their situation. I've mentioned in Blue Velvet the depiction of immature yet powerful men and men's ignorance causing danger and damage to those around them, and obviously Lost Highway's depiction of toxic masculinity. And Twin Peaks mainly represents that theme in Bob. Through Bob we see depictions of violence, murder and sexual assault. And something particularly interesting about the depiction of sexual assault is the aspect of it that involves the victim, Laura Palmer's father, Leland Palmer. A frighteningly large percentage of sexual assaults, particularly towards children and young adults, are committed by family members, and a frighteningly large percentage of those are committed by the father. Overall, men are responsible for about 3/4 of all child sexual abuse. So, Lynch's choice to use Leland Palmer not only has the impact of those horrible crimes, but also the impact of his connection to Laura, a horrifying realization that is perfectly depicted by Cheryl Lee's performance. And I think Bob represents that evil as a living character, and the evil that possesses and takes over individual people, causing them to do those things, showing that those acts are truly evil. But the interesting thing is, Bob is possessing and taking over men, implying that the acts that men are committing are truly evil, to the point of almost being completely consumed by and taken by that evil. Again, case in point, Leland Palmer, a father that assaults, harms and abuses his daughter, sending her into a traumatic spiral that results in her death. Yet when we see him as his true self, he doesn't recognize that evil side of his life. He's a different person. These are real things that happen to real people and are institutions of our society that are upheld by men. But maybe that's all Bob is, the evil that men do. That's a direct quote from Albert in Season 2, Episode 9. Within the show, that serves as an indication that Bob is otherworldly, a parasitic demon entity from the Black Lodge who has breached the real world to cause havoc. This implies that Bob is a spiritual representation of the evil of man, presented through the ways that the cycle of abuse and violence poisons the town. The way I see it, Bob's ability to possess any man isn't coincidental. It's a careful choice by Lynch and Frost, as a way to show that any man is capable of those horrific crimes, highlighting the difficulty in knowing who you can actually trust. When Bob possesses people to cause harm, he feeds on the pain and suffering that he causes, almost as a literal interpretation of the way that predatory men feed on the pain they cause. It's also interesting that Leland mentions knowing Bob as a child, implying that Bob has been preying on Leland for a long time, making a possible connection to the way that predatory men's behaviour is something groomed into them from a young age. Laura Palmer is also depicted as being connected to both of the mentioned two worlds, possibly showing the way in which trauma victims escape from reality as a response to the horrible things they experience. Despite its different approach, Twin Peaks still manages to connect itself to both themes that I've mentioned, connecting to the themes of male behaviour through the existence of Bob as a character and his effect on the characters within Twin Peaks, but also connecting to the theme of choosing fantasy over reality through the way in which the characters would rather pretend that overbearing, evil presence doesn't exist within their town. There is so much more I could talk about when it comes to Twin Peaks. There's Twin Peaks The Return, Fire Walk with Me, The Missing Pieces. There is so much media that covers Twin Peaks that if I talked about it all, I'd be here for days. So, bearing that in mind, let's move on. Mulholland Drive. Where the fuck do I start? The story of Mulholland Drive is somewhat similar to the story of Lost Highway. A character that's slowly approaching the end starts to fantasize about a better life with the person they loved. But that love is misplaced, and displays more as an obsession, rather than an actual romance. Mulholland Drive tells the story of Betty Elms, an actress who has arrived in Hollywood with a goal of becoming a movie star. After meeting Rita, a woman who does not remember who she is, they embark on a journey to find out the mystery of Rita's life. During this adventure into the unknown, they develop a romance that is portrayed as a passionate love. As the story goes on and as more is revealed, we learn that none of this is real. From start to end, Betty Elms' story is a lie. The events of this film are taking place within the mind of Diane Selwyn. Racked with guilt after calling out a hit on her ex, Camilla Rhodes, she imagines a life where they can be together. A life with the woman she loves. It turns out that Diane became infatuated with Camilla, a fellow actress, and there was a spark between them. But after finding out that Camilla was sleeping with the director of the film they were starring in, that spark fizzled out, resulting in Diane alone in her apartment, fantasizing about what might have been. Quickly looking back at the director, Adam, he engages Camilla in a sexual relationship. Now, while it seems that Camilla is using him to further her career, what's actually happening here is Adam is feeling emasculated after his wife cheats on him. So he uses his position of power and authority over Camilla to engage her in a relationship to regain some of his masculinity, driving a wedge between Camilla and Diane and forming a relationship with a damaging power imbalance, which quite obviously connects to the theme of problematic male institutions in society, in this case, Hollywood. Hollywood is a male-dominated industry in which men regularly abuse their power over women, a consistent problem that has only become more relevant and obvious in recent news. The way in which Camilla was essentially manipulated is a direct result of the way in which women are treated within that industry, and many other industries. The struggles that they faced were quite literally caused by the systems put in place by men. Betty and Rita are determined to find out who Rita truly is, so they venture around Hollywood searching for clues. And anytime we see links to reality and connections to the truth behind the story, the world feels like it becomes overwhelming and emotional. Almost as if those moments where reality seems to come back is showing that Diane is starting to remember what she did, and that overwhelming atmosphere is showing her guilt starting to grow. For her to then shut it down and jump back into the fantasy as the mystery seemingly gets more confusing. During this, Betty attends an audition and has compliment after compliment thrown her way, while Rita suffers due to her memory loss, meaning that within Diane's mind, they switch places, allowing Diane to also live a fantasy of a thespian success while Camilla is stuck in the shadows. However, this is all destroyed as Rita opens the box, turning away from the bright light of Diane's fantasy and looking into the darkness of the reality of her situation. I mentioned how obviously connected this film is to the theme of problematic male institutions, but it's also pretty obvious how this connects to the theme of fantasy and reality. It quite literally presents Diane's dream as the real world because she cannot face the truth of what happened. As I said before, she was racked with guilt, struggling to process what she truly did. She decided not to and dove deeper into her fantasy. And that's made incredibly clear towards the end as she begins to see Camilla in her apartment, showing that she really has lost the distinction between fantasy and reality. Something that might be reaching too far, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention, is the way in which male behaviour and toxic masculinity even manage to influence the relationship between two women. That dominating and frankly disgusting power that men and the patriarchy possess over the world we live in even manages to negatively impact a lesbian relationship, showing that under a patriarchy, people will never truly be free from it. Women will never truly have that freedom away from men as long as men keep taking that freedom away from women. It's also interesting to note that when Betty and Rita explore Diane's apartment within the dream world, they find that Diane has died alone in her apartment. As the film draws to a close, the real Diane kills herself, possibly hinting that suicide was her intention all along. Now, this is the part of my interpretation of Mulholland Drive that will probably seem like the most reaching that I've done in this video. I think that after Diane found out that the woman she loved had been taken from her by a man, she imagined her fantasy persona of Betty to play the more stereotypical masculine role in her story with Rita. Betty serves as the leader of their duo. She takes the role as the protector, and she fantasizes about Camilla or Rita in a very sexual light, especially in the moments leading to their intimacy. Diane places Betty as the controlling one who influences Rita's decision to join her in bed, but then dreams about Rita being the one who initiates sex, dreaming about her ex-lover being sexually forward as she would want her to be. The final message I want to talk about in Mulholland Drive is the cowboy. He represents the overbearing control that men have over Hollywood and the lives of our characters, connecting to that control that men have over the world and the way they manipulate and control women. Dressing him as a cowboy was also an interesting choice from Lynch, dressing the figure of masculine control as a very identifiable icon of idealized male role models. Cowboys being a symbol that is pushed on boys as a role model from a very young age alongside soldiers. So, that's 5 films down, and 1 more left to go. And what better way to end than with Eraserhead, David Lynch's first feature film, and my god did he kick off with a fucking weird film. Honestly, I didn't enjoy Eraserhead as much as the other films I've mentioned in this video. It's still really cool, but right now at least, it's 9th in my ranking of David Lynch films. It is also the film that I have the least to say about, but what I do want to talk about is still sufficiently bizarre. Eraserhead tells the story of Henry Spencer. After an awkward meeting with his girlfriend, Mary X, he learns that she's pregnant. Feeling forced into the commitment, they move in together and have a child. this child is really fucking weird. This mutant baby screams all day and all night and looks like Saddam Hussein's hiding spot. Henry lives in a weird, almost dystopian, industrial hellscape. His girlfriend's parents are weird and almost inhuman. Every social interaction and change to his life is terrifying. Even the woman across the hall that he's attracted to is framed in an unsettling light. When he dreams, unlike the characters in the previous films using their dreams to escape into a blissful ignorance, Henry's dreams are just as nightmarish as his real life, blurring the line between what he's imagining and what he's really experiencing. But I think this is intentional, because I think Lynch's intention was to hint that none of Eraserhead is truly real, at least not how we are seeing it. We're seeing Eraserhead as Henry is perceiving the world around him. I think the truth is, the world he lives in, his girlfriend, his apartment, his child, it's all normal. But his deep-rooted fear of commitment is causing him to see the world in a nightmarish mask that covers reality. And we are seeing that visually represented by this nightmarish style. So if we look at the story of the film without that disguise, what actually happened is Henry met his girlfriend's parents for a meal. Her parents were concerned with his lack of commitment, and Mary moved in with him. Tortured by his fear of commitment, Henry engages his neighbour and cheats on Mary. After being racked with guilt and an even more powerful fear of commitment, Henry is driven to commit filicide. He kills his newborn child. Seeing it from his self-absorbed view, he sees the world as a warped and distorted hellscape where he's the one normal person. This could hint at the deeply ingrained ignorance in men in relationships. The view that only the man is struggling, the assumption that the majority of the responsibility should be on the woman. Henry sees the people in his life as weird because they expect him to put work into his relationship and the life of his child, whereas he doesn't. It ties to that common attitude amongst men. They think a relationship is tying them down, restricting them, because instead of seeing their partner as a real person who also may be struggling, they can't bring themselves to understand that they are not the centre of the world. And Henry is exactly that. He is, in his eyes, the centre of the world. The one normal person left in this bizarre and dreamlike hellhole. I also find it fascinating that Henry dreams about sperm and sexual reproduction in such a surreal way. I think my interpretation of this connection is unintended, but I saw it as the way that men who are toxic and self-absorbed hold themselves to standards created by men that they then blame women for, and they compare themselves to men, showing that these toxic and insecure men think about and fantasize about men more than anyone else. Similarly to the way that no one thinks about gay sex as much as a homophobe. This film is really clearly connected to the themes that are present throughout Lynch's work, playing directly on the insecurities and fears of immature and irresponsible men, and depicting that by blurring the lines between fantasy and reality, depicting the real world as nightmarish in the eyes of Henry. And with that, I hope I've explained the links in each film clearly enough. With a lot of these, there was a lot more I could talk about, but it felt not entirely relevant to the themes. But anyway, let's move on. All of these films share several aspects of the same themes. I explained some parts of the themes briefly at the beginning, but allow me to go into a little bit more detail. David Lynch presents our characters with seemingly believable circumstances, realistic events, and sometimes normal mundane activities. A road trip, prison, an idyllic town, parenthood and childbirth, crime, Hollywood. Sure, Not all of these relate to the experience of an everyday person, but these are all real things that happen every day. Every single day, people live in prison. Every day, crimes are committed. Hollywood is responsible for abuse, neglect, manipulation, every day. There are idyllic towns that maybe aren't what they seem. People become parents, stop being parents, lose parents, go on road trips, have affairs, die. All of these things happen all the time. They are real situations that affect real people. And in real life, the people in those situations sometimes find their way out, or sometimes they stay suffering. But within the world of David Lynch's films, just like the real world, the most common solution people opt for is lies, deceit, imagination, fantasy, ignorance, and it never seems to work. As much as we would like to think that we can just dream of a better life, we can't. This relates to real life, especially now, in a world where people would rather ignore real problems facing the world than deal with them. Pretending that people aren't dying, pretending that people aren't suffering, pretending that there's absolutely nothing you could do to help anyone. Because people would rather believe that the world they live in is better than the world they read about in history. People would rather believe that their first world country is good, that they are safe, even when that is so far from the truth. People will still blind themselves with the fantasy that they have been sold by those in power, fantasies that they have been indoctrinated into believing. David Lynch's films take that concept and completely turn it around and throw it back at the viewer, turning those awful situations and the escapism that only leads to worse situations into a horrific, horrible life. Perhaps David Lynch was suggesting the escapism is never going to truly be a solution, that ignoring problems and living in a fantasy is only going to let those problems grow and worsen over time. A commentary that's only become increasingly relevant. I described it as fear of the mundane, and I recognised that a lot of the situations that these characters were in were not mundane. But a lot of the changes that were made in their fantasy versus the reality of what was happening were small changes. Seeing it as a fear of the mundane shows that people would rather escape into a fantasy world than deal with small problems, never mind the larger ones facing our world as a whole. Once you start ignoring the smaller problems, the bigger ones have an easier time sneaking up on you, which is usually what happened to the characters in Lynch's works. They were too distracted blocking out the noise of their insecurities that by the time they actually stopped to listen, it was too late. I love that theme, blurring the line between reality and fiction, by presenting people's fantasies as real and convincing the audience that what they're watching is real. It lets the audience be just as lost in the fantasy as the character is. But as I mentioned earlier, the other theme that is commonly present in David Lynch's films is, to me, more interesting. If you've seen my Alien video essay, it should come as no surprise that I love when a film has a theme of deconstructing the patriarchy or making commentary on the issues and institutions upheld by men as a means of control and manipulation. And David Lynch has a lot of that, which should be clear by the way that he writes his male characters. A lot of the time the men in his stories tend to come off as caricatures of male insecurities and ignorance. For example, Fred in Lost Highway completely misunderstanding the female gaze and his insecurities blinding him to his real life. Characters like Jeffrey Beaumont, who became so self-absorbed in his obsession of being the man who saved the day that he ended up making the situations of the women around him worse, endangering their lives and the lives of the people they cared about, all for some misplaced fantasy of being seen as some sort of hero. I find it fascinating when a film makes critiques on things that have become the norm in our society, despite being some of the most dangerous aspects of our society, and the way that male behaviour and toxic masculinity is so widely ignored and accepted is one of the most dangerous parts of the world we live in right now. Not only is the patriarchy and that toxic male behaviour the cause of so many problems affecting every single person, but it also functions as a never-ending cycle of suffering, and unless we completely put an end to it, it will never stop on its own. Anyway, the reason I chose these two themes is not just out of my fascination with them. I think they are connected to each other and consistently intertwined throughout Lynch's works. David Lynch loves to include conspiracy theories and supernatural entities in his work, a way to show the character is convinced something otherworldly or hidden is going on, a way for the character to be convinced that someone is out to get them, which is usually used to isolate the characters from the people around them, as people don't believe them, or they are lied to and told that everything will be okay. This plays on those paranoid dreams that people have, but also plays on that bizarre conspiracy theorist attitude that a lot of men have about the world around them. Specifically the arrogant men that seem to be represented throughout these films. The kind of men that are adamant that the films they watch and the games they play, including what they describe as woke DEI, are some larger conspiracy to ruin gaming and ruin cinema, playing on that insecurity and paranoia that they have about the world trying to stop men from being men. A misplaced paranoia that they direct through rage towards the wrong people. He would very often identify corruption between an otherwise appealing surface. For example, the evil that hid itself within the town of Twin Peaks, or the truly dark nature of Fred's life in Lost Highway. Perhaps suggesting a need to question everything, showing the inability to trust things at face value, because hiding beneath that friendly mask might be true evil. Within his films, that's usually depicted through dreams and characters representing the evil nature of man. But within the real world, that could be seen as a connection to the way that the patriarchy is the evil presence that lurks underneath the mask of society. These are not the only themes present in Lynch's works. There are more that I could talk about, for example his use of split personalities, or the visual depiction of his dreamlike fantasies consistently featuring a zigzag pattern floor and large heavy curtains, and many more. I do want to clarify again that this is all my perspective. I'm not saying that any of this is guaranteed to be the meaning intended behind these films. I'm not speaking on behalf of David Lynch. I am merely sharing my interpretation. And let me also clarify that I'm not saying that these are particularly unique interpretations. I'm not saying that this is the first time anybody has made these observations. But what I am saying is, this is what I took away from watching David Lynch's films. A lot of the meaning behind art is very much down to the interpretation of the viewer. And this is the message or messages that I took away from them. David Lynch was a fascinating director. His work is so easily interpreted in many different ways, and because of his often reluctance to truly explain his perspective on the meaning behind his films, we will never really have a true answer of what his original intentions were. But I don't think that matters. I think a lot of the aspects of Lynch's films are obvious in their meaning and connection to the real world, but I also think that the audience's interpretation matters just as much as Lynch's original intention. There are so many messages and weird meanings throughout Lynch's worlds, and there are also more connections to the themes I talked about that I didn't have time to mention. And I encourage you to watch these films if you haven't already, and make your own interpretations, because there is so much more to see from David Lynch. Anyway, the themes that I have covered are, to me, Lynch's most fascinating ones. And their consistent connection to each other only makes that more fascinating. Lynch's methods of depicting the dangers of masculine-fueled crimes and the denial that the world hides in avoiding dealing with the problems that we face every day are incredible. I already mentioned my bias towards themes like this, but I have to say, David Lynch's films, particularly Lost Highway, demonstrate this theme in some of the coolest ways I've ever seen. And he also manages to surround those themes with incredible characters, mind-bending worlds, and legitimately heartbreaking stories. You might come away from this video thinking that the themes I talked about are not actually present in these films. Or you may think that I'm reaching or exaggerating my points to find a non-existent connection, which is fine. As I said, This is my interpretation, and I had fun sharing it. Once you take a step into Lynch's Wonderland, there doesn't seem to really be a way out. And I'm not sure I want to find one.